I'd always heard Mexico was beautiful, a land of vibrant colors, spicy food, and the warmth of family. But all I could think about as we crossed the border was how damn hot it was. I was cramped in the back seat of my mom's ancient Toyota, sweating through my shirt, half listening to her lecture my sister Rosa about college applications. My head was pressed against the window, my eyes tracing the endless stretch of desert and cactus, the occasional flicker of life in the form of a rundown gas station or a stray dog trotting across the road. We were heading to my mom's hometown, some tiny village in the middle of nowhere, Mexico, to visit family I'd never met. I was just an 18-year-old kid from California, and I had no idea what to expect. I hadn't been back to Mexico since I was a baby, and the thought of spending a whole summer here felt like a punishment. But Mom was insistent. "It's important to know where you come from," she'd say. Rosa, who was just a year younger than me, was less thrilled. She'd bring her headphones and ignore the world, while I sulked in silence. When we finally pulled up to my grandmother's house, I was exhausted, covered in dust and not in the mood for a family reunion. My cousins greeted us with the kind of warmth that was suffocating, cheek kisses, hugs that lingered too long, and rapid Spanish I could barely keep up with. It was chaos, but there was one person who stood out: Miguel. He was my age, and we connected immediately. He had this mischievous glint in his eyes that promised trouble, the kind I was itching to find in this dull little town. Miguel spoke a mix of Spanish and English, switching between the two effortlessly, and he wasted no time dragging me away from the crowd of relatives. We spent the first couple of days exploring the village, riding our bikes down narrow dirt roads and climbing over crumbling stone walls that looked like they'd been there for centuries. Miguel knew all the best places to hang out, the hidden spots where the river ran clear and cool and where you could get tacos for almost nothing. He told me stories about the town's history, its legends and superstitions, all with a grin that suggested he didn't believe a word of it. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, Miguel leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "I know a place," he said, his voice low and secretive, "a place nobody goes." I was hooked immediately. "Where?" "It's a bit far," Miguel continued, scratching at the dirt with his sneaker, "but it's worth it. Old, creepy, and untouched, like stepping back in time." I didn't need much convincing. I was itching for something real, something that would make this trip feel like more than just a family obligation. So the next morning, before our mothers could rope us into chores or another endless round of family visits, we set off on our bikes, heading out of town and into the thick, wild scrubland that surrounded the village. The ride was rough, the heat punishing, and the land stretched on forever, but Miguel kept us moving, following a path that only he could see. We wove through clusters of thorny brush and dodged the occasional snake slithering across the trail. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, swallowed up by the wilderness. After what felt like hours, Miguel stopped. "We're close," he said, pointing ahead at a thick patch of vegetation, overgrown and wild. It looked like a small forest in the middle of the desert, an oasis of green. I followed him in, the ground crunching beneath our feet as we pushed through the thick underbrush. The air was cooler here, the sun blotted out by dense foliage. Miguel moved quickly, ducking under branches and over rocks, like he'd done this 100 times before. I was just about to ask him how much farther when the ground gave way beneath me. It wasn't a slow, crumbling kind of fall. One second I was standing, and the next I was plummeting into darkness. The wind knocked out of me as I tumbled down, hitting rocks and roots on the way down. My mouth filled with dirt and the taste of blood. I heard Miguel shout, a brief panicked scream, before I hit something hard, then cold, water. The shock of the plunge ripped the air from my lungs. I thrashed, disoriented, my legs kicking against nothing, arms flailing in the inky water. For a terrifying moment, I couldn't tell which way was up. But then my head broke the surface, and I sucked in a desperate breath, the darkness around me echoing with the sound of dripping water. I could hear Miguel's frantic splashing nearby. "Carlos!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "You okay?" I coughed up water, my chest burning. "Yeah," I croaked, though my entire body was shaking. What the hell was that? Miguel was treading water, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know. I didn't see it. A sinkhole, maybe? I glanced up, but the entrance was lost in darkness. We had fallen far, maybe 20, 30 feet. There was no way to climb back up. The walls were sheer rock, slick with moisture. I turned in circles, trying to get my bearings, but the water was black, and the cavern around us was even darker. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice echoing off unseen walls. Miguel just shook his head. "Some kind of cenote," he said, the word sounding foreign and ominous. "But this isn't on any map." I looked around, heart pounding. The air was thick, damp, and foul, carrying a sour metallic scent that made my stomach churn. The cenote was like a giant underground chamber, its ceiling high above us, and the water was eerily still, broken only by our panicked movements. Every sound seemed amplified, bouncing around in the vast empty space. We swam toward a narrow ledge that jutted out from the wall, dragging ourselves out of the water and onto the cold rock. My limbs felt heavy, my muscles sore from the fall. Miguel sat beside me, breathing hard, his face pale in the dim light that filtered down from the hole above. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice cracking. Miguel didn't answer right away. He was staring at something on the far side of the chamber, a dark opening in the rock, a tunnel. "We get out," he said finally. "We have to find a way out." I followed his gaze, my gut tightening. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and it disappeared into pitch black. But it was our only option. The thought of staying here, trapped in this hellish pit, was worse than whatever might be waiting in that tunnel. We didn't talk much as we climbed down from the ledge and made our way to the tunnel entrance. The rock walls were wet and slimy, and the darkness inside was absolute. Miguel found a small rock and scraped it against the wall, creating a faint spark that revealed the jagged contours of the passage. I wished for a flashlight, a phone, anything that could pierce the thick, suffocating darkness. We shuffled forward, the air growing colder with each step. I could feel the weight of the earth above us, pressing down, like we were sinking deeper and deeper into the bowels of the world. My breathing was loud in my ears, my heartbeat louder. I kept close to Miguel, my fingers brushing against the cold, damp wall. Every few minutes we would stop, listening to the silence. But it wasn't really silent. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a distant dripping, a shuffling that echoed through the tunnel like whispers. It set my nerves on edge, but I told myself it was just water, the movement of air through the passage. Nothing more. We pressed on, moving slower now, our nerves fraying with each step. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching off in impossible directions. I lost track of how long we'd been walking, hours maybe, or just minutes. It all blended together in the darkness. Then something changed. The air grew warmer, thick with the stench of decay. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. Miguel stopped, his body tense, his eyes fixed on something ahead. "What is that?" he whispered. I squinted into the darkness, my heart pounding. Shapes. Tall, thin shapes that seemed to blend into the rock. My mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Stalagmites, shadows, tricks of the light. But then one of the shapes moved. It turned slowly, a shuffling movement that sent a chill down my spine. There were people, or things that looked like people, standing just beyond the edge of our vision. They were thin, emaciated, with skin that clung to their bones like parchment. Their eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. Miguel grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. "Run," he whispered, his voice breaking. We bolted, scrambling back the way we'd come. The creatures moved after us, their footsteps a soft, shuffling sound that grew louder, faster. I could hear Miguel's panicked breathing beside me, feel the raw terror in every step. We ran blindly, desperately clawing our way through the darkness. The tunnel seemed to twist and stretch endlessly, and every turn brought more confusion, more dead ends. I could hear the creatures behind us, closing in, their grotesque forms moving with an unnatural, jerky speed. Miguel stumbled, his foot catching on a loose rock. He went down hard, skidding on the slick ground. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him up, but he yanked back, his eyes wide and filled with something I hadn't seen before. Pure, unfiltered terror. "Go!" he screamed, shoving me away. "Carlos, just go!" I hesitated, panic flooding my mind. But the sounds behind us, the shuffling, the grotesque slapping of bare feet on wet stone, were getting louder. I could see the shadowy figures lurching closer, their skeletal hands reaching out, their mouths opening and closing in silent, ghastly motions. Miguel tried to stand, but one of the creatures reached him first. It grabbed him by the leg, pulling him down with a strength that defied its frail appearance. Miguel screamed, a sound so primal and raw it cut through me like a knife. He kicked and thrashed, but more of the creatures were on him now, clawing at his clothes, their skeletal fingers digging into his flesh. I reached out, desperate to grab his hand, to pull him away from the nightmare unfolding in front of me. But Miguel's face twisted in pain and horror as the creatures tore into him, their movements frantic, hungry. Blood splattered the walls, dark and wet in the faint light. Miguel's screams turned into gurgles, his eyes locking with mine in one final, desperate plea. But I couldn't help him. I couldn't do anything but watch as they dragged him into the darkness. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away. I turned and bolted, my legs burning my lungs on fire. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in endless, mindless loops. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Every step was a struggle, every second a battle against the urge to collapse. I kept running, tears streaming down my face, Miguel's last screams echoing in my head. Somehow I found myself in a larger chamber, a place where the air felt fresher, less oppressive. I could see a faint light ahead, just a tiny pinprick, but it was enough. I stumbled toward it, my legs weak, my body numb. The light grew brighter, and I realized it was daylight. Real, honest-to-God daylight. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it was there, a slit in the rock that led to freedom. I forced myself through the gap, my clothes tearing on jagged edges, my skin scraping against stone, but I didn't care. The light was blinding, warm, and real. I burst out of the tunnel, collapsing onto the hard, sun-baked ground outside. I was gasping for air, my mind still reeling, my body covered in cuts and bruises. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, staring up at the sky, the blue so bright and clean it hurt my eyes. The world was silent, peaceful, a stark contrast to the nightmare I'd just escaped. But I couldn't stop shaking. Miguel was gone. My cousin? My friend? I'd left him down there, alone with those things. I couldn't save him. I hadn't even tried. Eventually, I staggered to my feet, limping back toward the village in a daze. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, and everything looked different, strange. My body ached, and my mind was numb, replaying the horror over and over. I kept expecting to see one of those creatures lurching out of the bushes, to hear Miguel's voice calling for help. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the dry grass. When I finally made it back to my grandmother's house, the sky was dark, and the lights were on inside. My mother and Rosa were waiting on the porch, their faces twisted with worry. I must have looked like hell, dirty, bloodied, and wild-eyed. My mom rushed to me, her hands shaking as she grabbed my face, her eyes searching mine for answers. What happened? Where's Miguel? I couldn't speak. My throat was raw and every word felt like broken glass. I just shook my head, tears welling up, and I collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. They took me inside, cleaned my wounds, tried to calm me down, but I couldn't explain. How could I? How could I tell them what I'd seen, what I'd done? They searched for Miguel for days, combing the area around the cenote, but they never found him. No one would believe what really happened, of course. The officials chalked it up to a tragic accident. He fell, got lost, maybe drowned in some unreachable part of the cave system. But I knew the truth. Miguel wasn't just lost. He was taken. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream about that cenote. I can still see Miguel's face, hear his screams echoing in the darkness. I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and for a moment, I can't tell if I'm back in that tunnel, trapped underground with those hollow-eyed creatures. I've tried to put it behind me, but the memories cling to me like a stain I can't wash off. I can't help but wonder what else is down there, hiding in the dark, waiting. And I know, deep down, that some things are better left undiscovered. Some places are meant to stay lost, buried beneath the earth, and far beyond the reach of the living. Because down there, in the endless, suffocating darkness of that forgotten cenote, Miguel isn't the only one who's been swallowed whole.